So I will ask the first question. Given the very significant developments surrounding Indian foreign policy, let me ask you first about European Union-Indian deal. So
Mhm.
after 19 years, the European Union and India signed a major FTA and security pact. Is this a direct response to Trump-era trade pressure? And does it strengthen India as a real third pole in the Indo-Pacific beyond US-led frameworks? Like the Quad.
Yeah, that's such a good question. As you know, it's been called the mother of all deals. So yes and no. So on one hand, the EU has tried for a very long time to be part of India's growth story and also gain market access to essentially what has been one of the most protected markets in the world. So this has been something that the EU has hoped for a very long time. But yes, I think President Trump's tariffs did change the game, for India, right? And how India thought about trade deals. And so what you see with this trade deal is a couple of things. There's some concrete wins on both sides, which I think is very interesting. So, for example, it's a big win for German car makers, where you now have tariffs coming down from levels that are close to 110% to about 10%, right? But it's not just cars. Like you have other winners in the EU, big machinery, pharmaceuticals, food and beverage exporters. And then on the Indian side, there are also some big winners, which are the textiles and the apparel industry, which gives them access, to the EU market, right? Chemicals and plastics, jewelry, things like that. So there's some big wins on both sides. But I think what is really interesting, and this touches on your question about India as the third pole, right? What you see here with this deal is India's now definitely willing and trying to diversify, right? You had the strategic alignment between the United States and India. And the first Trump administration, the Biden administration really, really went out on a limb to deepen cooperation with India and bring it on board as a strategic partner. There's bipartisan consensus in the United States on the importance of India as a strategic partner. But then you had President Trump come in for the second time, and the game seemed to shift, right? So, I mean, if you recall, right after President Trump was sworn in, Prime Minister Modi reached out immediately. India was one of the first countries to reach out. Vice President J.D. Vance visited India almost right away, and yet it didn't seem to move the needle. And then you had the 50% tariffs imposed in India. And I think it was a big shock. So, what this EU deal does is it shows that India is diversifying and it shows that India is willing now to make these trade deals, which, yes, as time goes on, could end up making not just, the India a pole, but also the EU, right? Because essentially what you're seeing is that if the EU is signing these deals, it means that a lot of trade in future is actually going to revolve around European Union regulations and rules. So a move away from US regulations and rules. So there's be more of an EU regulatory state and much less United States impact, right? And so it's not just India as a pole, it's also the EU as a pole. So a
Mhm.
truly multipolar world is what we are moving towards.
So when I saw the news about the trade deal, I thought India and European Union, especially these days, EU is thinking twice about the survivability of NATO and try to get distance from the US. So India is trying to cooperate with EU to balance against some kind of pressure from the President Trump. But suddenly, there was a US-India trade deal again. So it's kind of confusing. So with Washington lowering tariffs and India reportedly reducing Russian oil dependence, has India moved from strategic autonomy toward a more transactional alignment with the US? Or these days we talk about the concept of multi-alignment. So uh, can you touch upon this?
Yes, I am very skeptical that there is now a new trade deal between US and India, right?
Okay.
I know that's something that you had asked me about and whether we should touch on it. But if you think about it, all of the announcements about the great trade deal between the US and India came from one source. And that source was President Trump on Truth Social. Right?
Hmm.
But if you noticed the reaction of Prime Minister Modi, right, and Minister Goyal, they were much more circumspect, right? They were very circumspect about the deal and very cagey, and there've been really no details on the ground. So, for example, even on Truth Social, President Trump said, "Well, the tariffs are going to go from 50% to 18%, but 18% is higher than the tariffs that were on India when President Trump came into office." Right? So no matter
Mm.
what, India is still worse off than before President Trump's inauguration, right? So, and then on top of that, President Trump said that, again, on Truth Social, that India has agreed to stop purchasing Russian oil. Um, there was no comment on that from the Indian government. Not a single comment. There was no confirmation. There has been no comment from any official touching on that. And the bottom line is that we don't know that that's actually true, right? It may happen uh, in a very phased out, slow way. But so far, there's been nothing from any Indian official, any statement, nothing that shows that is actually correct. So yes, there's been, oh, now the United States has a trade deal with India, but the details are so thin. And the comments have all been from President Trump's Truth Social feed, right, as well as the USTR. And there's been almost nothing from the Indian side. So I'm a little cautious before I call it a trade deal.
Great. Very interesting. So, as of February 2026, President Trump has been criticized domestically and also from the allies. So, do you think that then President Trump's announcement influenced by the move by Indian government to cooperate with the EU, or does he intend to facilitate the negotiation process of the Ukraine war by, asking India to stop import Russian oil?
Yeah, I think it is particularly with this president, and in this term, I think it is very difficult to predict why he does what he does. But,
Okay.
but I will say that I think that the EU signing that deal with India was definitely an impetus. I mean, it is a big deal. Essentially, what it shows is that India, which historically has not been excited about trade deals, is now enthusiastic to sign trade deals. That's a big shift, right? And India is a large market. And if India is willing to sign a deal with the EU with a much more legally binding pact, what that then shows is that India is now structuring its trade towards the EU and away from the United States. Now, this is not going to necessarily have an immediate effect, but in the long run, it is absolutely going to, have an effect in about a decade, right? So what you're seeing is pushback on India's part, not just on strategic autonomy, but an indication that you can't just push India around. And so therefore you had this trade deal in India-Russian. So that I think sent a very strong signal to President Trump. And I do think that had something to do with his decision to announce it.
Very interesting. You said strategic signal to President Trump. These days, European leaders are visiting Beijing, and that might also put some pressure on President Trump. So even though US is number one, was the strongest country in the world, the act or move by allies and strategic partners can put some pressure on the decisions and thinking of President Trump. I think that's very insightful.
I think with the EU particularly, it's a big deal because the EU's rules and regulations are so different from the United States, right? So, for example,
Mhm.
if you take something like health and safety regulations that come from the EU around products is very, very different from the United States, whether that's on food, on cosmetics, what have you. So, what that means is that if you're essentially crafting a product for a certain market, and then you follow all the rules and regulations of that market, then that becomes your primary market, right? So when India signs a trade deal with the EU and it's now gearing its products towards the EU market, in 10 years, that means those are the rules and regulations that it's going to be bound by and not as much the United States, right? It's basically sidelining the United States. And so I think that will have an impact. And you
Mhm.
can see
Great.
that in the different trade deals that are cropping up.
From a longer perspective, you've published great articles and book about Indian foreign policy, especially strategic narrative. So India is often called as a reticent rising power, strong capabilities, but not full commitment to a specific bloc, especially Western bloc. Does that restrain or weaken India's leadership role, or actually is it that strategic ambiguity actually its main source of leverage?
That's a great question. I think it's both
Mhm.
because in some ways it limits India's ability to shape the international order, right? It limits its ability in leadership because it's not cementing these partnerships with any one bloc, right? On the other hand, it gives India a lot of flexibility with other countries, right? It gives it a lot of leverage. So in some ways, it's both a handicap and a strength, right? It's really both. And you can see this again, when it came into play with the United States. I mean, it's because on one hand, it's because of India's strategic autonomy that India was able to purchase Russian oil, and the Biden administration let it slide, right? And then the Trump administration came in and cracked down on it. But then again, India decided to flex strategic autonomy and move towards the EU, right? So it's both a handicap and a strength.
Okay, great. Now let's move to a more comprehensive view about the changing world orders. There was a national security strategy published at the end of the last year and also national defense strategy. So there are so many interpretations about U.S. grand strategic changes. And now, for me, the US appears to apply different logics, different rules in different regions. For example, assertive sphere of influence logic in Western Hemisphere, but US does not seem to recognize Chinese sphere of influence in Indo-Pacific and very limited sphere of influence in Eastern Europe by Russia. So how can we explain this theoretically? If we apply 20th century's IR theory to this U.S. grand strategy, it's very hard to explain. So do you have any view about the U.S. Architecture?
Again, a really interesting question. So I tell my students this all the time, that just because a theory is interesting and compelling and is held for a while doesn't mean it doesn't have flaws, right? And I think that's what you see with power transition theory. So power transition theory is so much centered on the challenger to the system, right? So if you look at power transition theory, it suggests that no matter how we conceive of the international system, you always have a great power, and then eventually there's a challenge to that great power, and the challenger is a dissatisfied rising power, right? The challenger is dissatisfied with how power is distributed in the international system. It's dissatisfied with how public goods are distributed, and therefore you have conflict with the great power, and therefore you have war, right? Now, what this does is this doesn't leave room, as you just pointed out, to talk about, well, what happens when the great power changes the rules of the game, right? What happens when it's not the challenger that's breaking the international order, but it's the great power? And I think what's particularly interesting in the United States case is that the United States crafted this order, the global international order after World War II, with the help of allies and partners. And what you see here is now a move away from the global international order. And I don't want to say that this is just about the Trump administration. The Biden administration, too, moved away from the liberal international order, right? So it's not just the Trump administration that has decided to weaken the liberal international order. Under the Biden administration, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talked about the rules-based order, but when he talked about diversifying supply chains and friendshoring, that's essentially a move into these little groups and blocks and a move away from the widespread multilateral cooperation that was the bedrock of the liberal international order. So it's both the Biden and the Trump administration that have done that. And I don't think power transition theory has a good explanation for that. And I think there's another part of it, which is that I'm going to add to this to say that there's another thing that I think requires explanation. And so for the students out there or young junior faculty who are interested, I think one of the outcomes of the great power actually breaking the order that it created is fragmentation, right?
Mhm.
And so what you're seeing now is fragmentation into, I think, what you yourself have talked about as conflicting orders, right? And the fragmentation, interestingly, is coming not necessarily from the countries that we see as revisionist, but countries that are partners and allies, right? Because these partners and allies now feel betrayed by the United States or are uncertain of the United States and are therefore scrambling to, carve up the order. And it's an open question whether they're going to maintain it or whether you're going to have multiple orders come up in response to the United States actions. And I really don't think there are any excellent international relations theories out there that have an explanation for some of the phenomena that we're seeing in real time today.
Great. I think your point about that the hegemonic power could be revisionist in terms of power transition is a very good point. So last question is about the future international order. We don't know yet, but President Trump's experiment with very different options of foreign policy, such as tariff, protectionist. Sometimes people call neo-isolationist. Sometimes people say offshore balance and restraint, all those things. There might be some correction because there might be some bad results, as we see already. And so after the midterm election, we don't know the result of the election. But if you look at the history of U.S. domestic politics after midterm election, there was a changes of the course of foreign policy reflecting American people's viewpoints. And then there might be 1 or 2 years new president, which can set a new domain for the American foreign policy. We don't know yet what will emerge after all these experiments. So, can we talk about the major components or variables that will make the future international order? That's very hard, but we will maintain this fragmentation, or can we build a new type of more, cooperative international order?
Yeah. Well, I like to be optimistic and think we can. Um, I think there are a few things at play here. I think the first is it'll be interesting to see whether Trumpism outlasts President Trump. This is his last term. So, can Trumpism survive without President Trump? And that's an open question. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. Whether it's, as I said, when we talked about the Biden administration, they had also moved away from the rules-based order, right? But to what extent President Trump's successor and how fast and how intensely they will continue his policies remains to be seen. So we don't know that. So I think that's one variable. The other variable that we don't really mention because I think President Trump and the United States consume so much airspace, right? Particularly President Trump is so larger than life. And I think that consumes a lot of time and energy in coverage. But it's interesting because if you look at China, China hasn't really articulated a clear Chinese vision of order, right? I don't see that emanating from the CCP. And with China as well, there are a lot of factors that are unknown. I mean, one of the things that is, on the table right now is you've seen the purges that have happened with the Chinese military, right? And so it'd be interesting to see going forward how China thinks of the international order, because for a large part of its rise, in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, even I would argue, that China was not revising the rules-based order. China was utilizing the rules-based order to rise. So if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, if you look at the AIIB, these don't go against the principles of the rules-based order, right? The consequence of it was that China was slowly using those rules to cement its own power. But they didn't fundamentally contravene how we think about the rules-based order in terms of economic cooperation, in terms of multilateral cooperation, in terms of multilateral institutions. So I haven't seen anything, and I'd be very interested to get your take on this as well. I haven't seen anything where President Xi and China have, or anybody in China has laid out what the alternative, or the Chinese path, or the Chinese alternative to the liberal international order would be. Okay, beyond the fact that it wouldn't be liberal, right? I'll put that on the table. I think that's one unknown. And I think finally, the third thing, and this is not an unknown, I think this is what we can definitively say is that where we are today is in a state of flux, right? We're really seeing flux in real time. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this is a risky period in world politics, right? Because you're really transitioning from bipolar world to what Samuel Huntington called a uni-multipolar world, and now we're really entering an era perhaps of multipolarity. With all of this in flux, with the liberal international order being broken by the United States, with China not having articulated an international order, and with partners and allies trying to figure out their role in all of it. So I think the one thing we can say with certainty is that not only are we in a period of flux, but it's a risky period, right? And I'm interested to see what comes next.
Great. You talked about the absence of the alternatives to international order. China has been proposing international order, but it is not very new and not very elaborate. I think the real point is China is ready to take the role of hegemon, which can provide all the necessary international public goods, which is really a hard job that should require Chinese domestic people's consensus and also recognition by international society. But the demand of the international public goods are enormous, thinking about all the problems that international society now have. So there are arguments about middle power coalition, like-minded countries cooperation can maybe propose some kind of alternative to great power politics. These days, we talk about great power concert, sphere of influence, the condominium of great powers, which is not very beneficial to South Korea or some other middle powers. After Prime Minister Carney's, great address, so we talk about Carney doctrine. But some people say that it's a good thing, it's very ideal. But do middle powers really have the policy measures to construct a new international order? So as you are, studying middle power cooperation very much, so can you add something about that?
Yeah, so I think that middle powers can't do it by themselves, right? So I think this is why acting in concert is really important. And I do think that Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos was very important in that regard because it was a call to arms, if you will, right? For cooperation and for middle powers to chart a path together. I think what's interesting about it, so again, if we go back to the international relations theory literature, middle powers is not a very well-defined concept, right? Who's a middle power? And so, who do you think of as a middle power? And traditionally, it's been countries that self-define as middle powers, right? So Canada is a middle power because it calls itself a middle power, and it's this mid-sized country. And Australia is a middle power because it says it's a middle power, also a middle-sized country. But it's not really territorially dependent, right? I mean, you also have countries that are smaller that punch above their weight in international relations. So South Korea is one. Singapore is one, right? Singapore is a small state that punches above its weight. And so what would be interesting to me is to see a focus on middle powers that's not just focused on the Western partners of the United States, which is traditionally what middle powers have kind of self-defined as, right? And to see what that looks like when you truly take into account partnerships between middle powers that are not just in Europe, but also in Asia and perhaps even in Africa, right? Latin America and Brazil. So, so I think that would be game changing. I think that would truly be game changing. And you can see steps towards that. I mean, we started this conversation with the India EU deal. I think of India as a middle power, right? And so there, what you're seeing is something happening because you have these partners and allies getting together and moving away from trade rules and regulations, a trade that's dominated by the rules and regulations of the United States towards something else, right? And I think that can affect a difference. So you're right, middle powers by themselves A single middle power by itself doesn't have the clout, but those partnerships, I do think they have a lot of potential and a lot of clout, particularly if you start defining middle powers beyond the West.
Okay, I think this is the end of the interview. Thank
Great.
you very much.
Thank you so
You've
much.